Thank you so much, Asfar. Assalamu alaikum, and good morning and good evening and good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, to everyone who's gathered. It's a real tribute to you and the Nutshell conferences, Asfar, to bring us all together. I start every talk with gratitude. This one not only is not different, but in this moment of Corona crisis, when so many of you are experiencing grief and loss, and all of us are experiencing a level of anxiety. Gratitude for the fact that we're all together, that we have the privilege of even being able to reimagine together what this world could be, and to work on it with the kinds of resources that we do, not to mention for the homes that we have and the way that we can shelter. Gratitude. Asfar asked me to spend about 20 minutes telling you what Acumen does, and really think about it in this moment. And so we started this organization 19 years ago, 2001, with the mission of changing the way the world tackles poverty. I had worked on Wall Street, and I'd also worked on building a microfinance bank in Rwanda. Both places that have known different kinds of crises, and Rwanda an extraordinary humanitarian one. And so I've kind of cut my teeth on crisis and innovation. But what I came out of both experiences with was this idea that neither markets alone nor charity alone was enough to solve our problems of poverty, that we had to reimagine it, and that what was most critical was to see capital as a tool, not as something that would control us, and to stand with the poor in everything we did. And what we meant by that was that if we could design our systems to include the poor and the vulnerable first, they would be much more resilient, and they would be much more powerful for all of us. But until we did that, we were going to have this bifurcated system. In the very beginning, we had a single big idea, essentially, that sat at the middle of Acumen, which was patient capital, that we would raise philanthropic money and then we would invest it in intrepid entrepreneurs who were going where markets had failed the poor, where government and aid had fallen short, in critical services like healthcare, education, energy, agriculture, housing. We would invest for 8 to 12 years, sometimes longer, and we would accompany our entrepreneurs with the kind of management assistance and social connections that would enable them to try and fail and try again until they'd actually not only built companies, but in the best of cases, changed systems. And we would not only measure what mattered and learn to do that on the impact side, but any money that came back to Acumen, because we were a nonprofit, would be reinvested in innovation for the poor. Over time, we've invested about $130 million in about 130 companies, and brought in co-investment, increasingly traditional forms of capital, to the tune of about $750 million, and have impacted over 300 million of the world's very poor. I'm just going to give you one example of not exactly how it works, but over time, before I do that, over time we realized that patient capital wasn't enough, that we needed to essentially build a network of ourselves, different kinds of products and tools that we could use. So we had the core of patient capital, which I've just described, and we built local offices around the world so that we would have the benefit of being locally rooted and globally connected in India, Pakistan, East Africa, West Africa, Latin America, and now the United States. As we saw some of our companies grow, we knew we needed more traditional kinds of capital even before some of the impact investors would go in. And so we've created 3 for-profit funds, one in energy, one in agriculture and climate change, one in Latin America, another 150 million in assets that are being managed in that pool under a separate subsidiary. We saw that the most important kind of capital was human capital. And so we started to invest in character and built a fellows program that now numbers about 700 fellows around the world, that then is buttressed by an online academy that has seen about 1 million people sign up and take courses on social entrepreneurship, all the different pieces that we teach our fellows, because we're seeing a movement, as all of you know and are part of, in how do we reimagine and rebuild systems for our world where too many of our traditional institutions have run their course. And if there's ever been a moment in our history, it's the moment of coronavirus that has exposed the gaping wounds to so many of our systems. As we learned to measure what matters and we stood with the poor, what we also came to understand was that unless we were listening to the voices of the poor, we weren't really measuring impact. And so we began a system where we would text thousands of customers from our companies at a time. We would get answers to their questions from which we would deduce real understanding of impact from the perspective of the poor clients and customers of our companies. Over time, so many other organizations saw value in that we became almost a consulting arm and decided to spin it off as a for-profit called 60 Decibels, which now has enumerators working in 200 languages in 40 countries around the world. And our hope is that we get enough data so that we can start to benchmark across not just financial metrics, but social metrics as we decide where to invest capital as individuals and as a society. The example, 2007, two guys came into our offices with a solar torch that cost about $30 and a dream to eradicate kerosene. At the time, 1.5 billion people lived in darkness and depended on kerosene for their light source. We took a bet at the prototype stage with our patient capital on this company called Dlights. We didn't know how to price it. There was no financing available. People didn't trust the product. There were no markets. That's what we're talking about when we say we invest in those intrepid entrepreneurs that are trying to build companies that can long-term build systems for change. Over a 10-year period, we put about $5 million of our philanthropic-backed capital into this company, and you can see how the company started to grow. About 2017, though, it needed a $50 million round, and that's where the for-profit Kawisafi Fund could help it actually get to scale. 12 of our fellows have worked in that company, and we also used our social capital to connect Dlight to companies like Unilever and Total so that they could work with their supply chains and really move this idea into the world. And it was thrilling at Davos this year to see Dlight announce to the world that they had just crossed 100 million low-income people on this planet that now have access to light and electricity because of that single endeavor. Role models and business models are what we need for a world that needs to reimagine capitalism. And so we saw around Dlight a number of other companies start to grow in this decentralized off-grid way of bringing solar electricity to low-income people. We're now the largest off-grid solar investor for the poor in the world. And so we can see across the industry, where does capital work? Where is it not working? Where do we need different kinds of partnerships with government for us to solve our electricity problems? And if you're looking at a continent like Africa, and I dare say Pakistan, where the grid is not reaching, this is such a powerful way to electrify low-income populations, rural populations, that is also an anti-fragility approach to how we solve our problems. In this moment of crisis, you can imagine in off-grid even, we've got to save this new infrastructure because it hasn't fully been embedded, certainly not in every country. So it's been thrilling to watch other players, corporations, development finance institutions, more traditional investors, individuals come together, and we're part now of a coalition that's beginning to collaborate to raise $100 million so that we can provide bridge financing and other kind of support for the off-grid sector. But it also makes me pause and look back, because I do think in a moment of crisis, we really face two choices. What we see too traditionally is the whole world recognizes that we're one, that we're connected, that we have never felt more human in our lives. Right now, we've probably not ever felt more vulnerable. But too often what we've seen is that we stave off the suffering during the emergency, and after we go back to the status quo. What's extraordinary about this moment is everyone I know is starting to understand that there is no going back to the status quo. The world is changing even as we speak, and all of us need to be thinking about how we reimagine the new systems for the world. I love that Asfar started by saying that crisis is also a moment for innovation. And when I think about the history of my own organization, and I listen to SAP and other corporations that are sitting on this call, so many of you who run organizations, it is in those moments of crisis that we define who we are as human beings, who we are as leaders, how we influence the world. We were 5 months old in New York City with a team, a mighty team of 4, that included my assistant, when the planes hit the towers the morning of 9/11. We were actually moving into our offices right next door to the World Trade Center. And I had losses in my extended family and network of friends. And so you ask yourself, what do we do? There was no bucket brigade to participate in. And so very quickly decided to do what we do best and bring a diverse crew together of people who could help us think through a fledgling organization that was focused on global poverty. I feared that many of our prospective donors would want to only focus on New York, despite how interconnected that day meant and was for all of us in the world. Had a roundtable at the end of it. Someone said, if you were king, what would you do? I said, I would go into the Muslim world and I would identify those extraordinary entrepreneurs that were building inclusive, sustainable entities to show the world what human beings were capable of doing inside their countries and out. Be careful what you say out loud. Within a few days, had received $1 million check and thought, now what do I do? As life would have it, I went to Pakistan. I'd never been there in my life. And yet I met extraordinary individuals who would change my life. The country would change acumen. And it has been a great privilege to work in that country, learn from that country. One of the first people I met was a man named Tasneem Siddiqui, who introduced us to the concept of incremental housing for the poor. Again, how do you start with the poor and understand their perspective and then build for them? Around that time, I also met a young man from Baltimore who's on the screen, Javad Aslam, Pakistani American who wanted to give back to his parents' homeland. And so he moved to Pakistan. He worked with Tasneem. We invested in him to build the first for-profit, affordable, low-income mortgage Sharia compliant product for the poor about 18 kilometers outside of Lahore. It was another journey full of crisis, ups and downs. But a few years ago, watching Javad, not only having built a viable community for about 3,000, an example, a role model, and a business model for the world, but to sell half his company and raise about $35 million from external foreign investors to repay acumen and show that this is possible, that we can solve these problems, is taking crisis and moving into changing ourselves in ways that teach. I also learned through many of the crises, including in Pakistan, the importance not only of character and capital, but of community. In the floods of 2010, a number of our board members called and said, even though acumen doesn't do emergency funding, come, witness, be a communicator, tell the stories, help raise grant funding for the emergency. And so I traveled the country with board member Ali Siddiqui. In the back is Farooq Khan, who would become our country director after that trip. And we did witness, and we saw the business community stand together and in Ali's case, feed and shelter 10,000 people. We learned who we were again as a community, and I started to understand that if we just saw ourselves as investors without understanding the community that was interwoven, we would sell ourselves and the communities we were serving short. Other community members like Farooq, like Zafar Khan and Zubair Sumro, Babar Ali, for the Pakistanis in the crowd, we're all coming together to ask, what could we do? How do we do it? Dr. Rashid Bajwa of the NRSP Bank, at the time we were working together to transform the nonprofit microfinance organization that NRSP Bank was doing with low-income farmers in the southern Punjab into a for-profit. And again, it was his moral imagination, his proximity to the communities that he was serving that enabled us to change the way we did business as we looked into the future. This idea of the moral imagination is so critical. It's the heart of what we need in the world right now. We need to find those entrepreneurs and be those individuals ourselves, no matter where we sit in our organizations, that have the humility to see the world around us and to recognize the ugliness that we're seeing in our systems, but not be people who fall into despair, nor cynics that do not act, nor simple empaths that throw money without recognizing that we simultaneously have to retool and imagine the future that could be and start moving toward it. And so I've been so excited of late to be talking to fellows in our community that are doing just that. And I just want to highlight a few. In Pakistan, there's 127 fellows. As I said before, these young leaders join about 700 fellows around the world in all of our geographies, including Malaysia, Bangladesh, the UK, Spain, and to watch them collaborate not only in their own country to try to solve problems that are within the domain of their control is just thrilling. A couple of weeks ago, I had a conversation with a woman named Sohani Mohan, who built a distributed manufacturing company in Bombay, India, to bring menstrual health products into rural areas of India where women have no access and where big commercial companies do not go. It's a long story, but she now has about 40 factories up and running. But when India went into lockdown, that distributed model that depended on people going door to door came to a standstill. At the time, menstrual health products were deemed non-essential goods. And so as a real entrepreneur, she, number one, fought and got the product deemed essential. But second, she partnered with Mahindra, one of the largest automobile and trucking manufacturing companies in India, who helped her retool her factories so that she could make masks, and gave her the use of one of their factories so that she would have a safe place to do it where her employees could sleep and work. When Muhammad Mustafa of Islamabad heard this story, he was thinking about whether he would have to close down his own company, Mauka Online, which is sort of an Uber for domestic workers based out of Islamabad. But instead, he took a cue from Suhani and quickly converted his company to one in which he trained and got materials to all of the different employees, the domestic workers, so that they could make masks inside their homes. And he used his platform, his technology platform, to ask his customers to donate masks, thereby providing enough revenue so that we could keep jobs. He can keep jobs going. He can provide to his country, and he can start to think about building more flexibility in for the future. We're also seeing fellows model what we need to see more of in the world that has been too focused on competition. What this virus is teaching us is we need collaboration. The man on your far right, Abdul Mufti, is a fellow working at the Ministry of Education for the Punjab. And when he was given the task of figuring out how to continue to educate kids when schools are shut, he turned and worked with two of his fellows, Daniel Noorani and Harun Yassin. Daniel, who has a television show that brings cartoons and stories to young people so that they can learn about their country values and gain education. And Harun Yassin, Talimabad, who has about 200,000 young people already taking his ed tech courses online. These two have been deeply creative in bringing content, and Abdal has also helped them get access to taking that content even wider in partnership, in collaboration with government. You've got civil society, private sector, and government represented. And Sarah Said Khurram, who runs Sehat Kahani, which is a health tech provider, a series of 26 clinics, health clinics for telemedicine, so that she could get doctoring and medicine to low-income rural women inside Pakistan. When the clinics were closed with lockdown, she turned to the app that is also part of her business and decided to make it free during this crisis. So as you can imagine, utilization and demand for the app went through the roof. And so suddenly she also found volunteer doctors across Pakistan, and realized that she was also getting people asking to volunteer from the diaspora. And again, working in collaboration with, this time, the Sindh government, she was able to get approvals so that she could move quickly, serve people. And what I'm watching is this unleashing of citizenship and creativity and collaboration, and this idea that technology and capital do not need to control us, we can control them. And there are so many stories like this. And this is the moment, again, where I see so much anxiety, where we also have to lift our role models and our business models. I just want to end with what this was, that what kept us all together, though, because at the bottom of this is a new value set. I'll let you read it yourselves, but this is a value set that has to put humanity, the earth, at the center of everything we do, and not profit. What makes me so sober is the crisis around us. We have a long way to go. We are going to go through a lot of pain together as a world. And what gives me that hard-edged hope that I talk about here is this community of people that I am seeing growing all across the world, who refuse to be pushed down by despair and are finding new ways to interact, new ways to work in the world. And so if I start with gratitude, let me end with love. Because if I have learned one thing, it is that we don't get dignity as a human race until all of us get dignity. And so I wish you all the best as you recreate and reimagine a world for all of us, which is the only world that will work. Thank you.